He was born into power, crowned in glory, ruler of the mightiest empire on earth. Yet his name would forever be tied to failure, George III, the British king who lost America. For some, he was a tyrant, the villain of revolution. For others, a tragic monarch, blind, stubborn, undone by forces he could not control. But history remembers him with a single title. George William Frederick was born in 1738. Unlike many royals, he was raised with strict discipline. He studied science, mathematics, languages, and philosophy. From a young age, George was earnest, serious, and deeply religious. He was not flashy or decadent like other kings. People called him Farmer George for his love of agriculture and simple living. Here was a prince who seemed humble, honest, even kind. The people believed he might be a new kind of monarch, one who truly cared for them. In 1760, at just 22 years old, George became King of Great Britain and Ireland. The empire he inherited stretched across the world: India, the Caribbean, Canada, and 13 growing colonies in America. To rule such an empire required vision, diplomacy, and wisdom, but George was young, proud, and determined to assert his authority. Britain had just emerged from the costly 7 Years' War. The treasury was drained. The government looked to America, the prosperous colonies, to help pay for the empire's defense. And so came the taxes. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, duties on paper, tea, and countless goods. To the king, it was fair. To the colonists, it was tyranny. Protests erupted. Colonists shouted, "No taxation without representation." They argued that since they had no voice in Parliament, Britain had no right to tax them. But King George saw it differently. To him, this was not about taxes. It was about obedience. If the colonies defied Parliament, they defied the Crown. And George would not tolerate defiance. In 1773, American rebels struck a symbolic blow. Disguised as Native Americans, they boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped crates of British tea into the sea. To the colonists, it was a protest. To the king, it was treason. George's patience snapped. He declared the colonies in rebellion. He ordered troops to be sent. The die is now cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph. His voice echoes as British regiments march, cannons rolling, ships sailing across the Atlantic. The stage was set. The King of Britain had chosen war. And America would never be the same. The young king who once promised hope, now stood on the edge of the bloodiest conflict of his reign. What began as a dispute over taxes would soon become a revolution, and the unraveling of an empire. Screen fades to black. Drumbeats echo like marching footsteps. It began in silence. A clash of farmers and soldiers. A spark that would set the world on fire. The American Revolution had begun. On April 19, 1775, British troops marched to seize colonial weapons in Concord. But on Lexington Green, they were met by armed militia. A shot rang out, history would call it, the shot heard round the world. The king's soldiers expected obedience. Instead, they found rebellion. What began as a skirmish soon turned into a retreat under fire. Farmers, blacksmiths, and townsmen rose up, striking at the world's most powerful army. Within days, thousands of colonial militia surrounded Boston, trapping British forces inside. The rebellion was no longer whispers in taverns, it was war. To George III, this was treason. To the colonists, it was liberty's first breath. By 1776, the colonies no longer sought compromise. Voices like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin declared a new reality: the United States of America. They no longer petitioned their king. They renounced him. The Declaration of Independence called George a tyrant, a ruler unfit to govern free men. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. Back in London, the king's fury boiled. To him, the Declaration was not just rebellion. It was blasphemy against crown and country. George vowed to crush the revolution. He declared the colonies outside his protection, their leaders traitors who deserved the gallows. By 1776, Britain deployed tens of thousands of soldiers, along with Hessian mercenaries from Germany. Their red coats and discipline seemed unstoppable against ragtag militias. The king unleashed the might of empire. But across the ocean, a leader was rising, a general who would test his patience and his crown. A tall Virginian planter turned soldier, George Washington, was appointed commander of the Continental Army. He was no seasoned general, but he had something the colonies needed: resolve. Where the king had power, Washington had purpose. And sometimes, purpose is enough to ignite a revolution. They captured New York in 1776. Washington's army barely escaped annihilation. Defeat followed defeat. To George III, the war seemed nearly won. But the flame of rebellion refused to die. Britain's leaders debated strategy. Some argued reconciliation. But the king remained firm. "I will never consent to the dismemberment of this empire." To George, America was not negotiable. Better to fight than to lose the jewel of the empire. One king, stubborn and proud. One general, desperate and determined. The war was only beginning, and soon, the world would join the fight. The might of Britain, carried on waves and in ranks of red-coated soldiers, descended upon the New World. This was no longer a rebellion. It was a war for the fate of a continent. The British Army captured New York City, forcing Washington into retreat. The redcoats seemed unstoppable, their cannons roaring, their discipline unbreakable. To George III, each British victory was proof. The rebellion would be crushed. Order would be restored. But Washington's genius was not in winning battles, it was in surviving them. He retreated, regrouped, and struck where least expected. In the dead of winter, when hope seemed lost, Washington struck a spark. The rebels were not finished. Not yet. 1777 brought a crucial moment. The Battle of Saratoga. British General Burgoyne marched from Canada, expecting to split the colonies in two. But American forces surrounded him. Burgoyne surrendered his entire army. To the king, it was a setback. To the world, it was a sign: the rebellion could win. The victory at Saratoga convinced France, Britain's ancient rival, to join the war. Soon, Spain and the Dutch followed. What began as Britain versus her colonies was now a global war. And the king's empire stood alone against half of Europe. British forces now fought not just in America, but also in the Caribbean, Africa, and India. The empire's strength was vast, but stretched thin. George demanded victory. But even an empire cannot fight the world at once. Meanwhile, Washington's army endured a brutal winter at Valley Forge. Soldiers starved, froze, and died of disease. Yet they endured. With training from Baron von Steuben, the ragtag rebels hardened into a real army. In London, the king believed the rebels were broken. But in America, hunger and hardship forged something stronger than steel. Philadelphia captured by the British but abandoned. Bloody battles at Monmouth, Camden, and Charleston. Guerrilla fighters harassing redcoats in the swamps of the South. Victory never came easy. The king's armies won ground but never peace. For every town they took, rebellion grew in another. Back in Britain, voices in Parliament begged for compromise. But the king refused. "I am fighting for the principle of dominion, and dominion I will maintain." To George, this was not about colonies. It was about empire itself. If America slipped away, what would stop India, the Caribbean, or Ireland from following? Better to bleed than to bend. To George. Two visions of destiny. One fought to preserve an empire, the other to create a nation. And soon, their conflict would reach its breaking point. It had been 6 long years of blood and fire. From Boston to the Carolinas, Britain fought to crush rebellion. But here, in Yorktown, the fate of an empire would be decided. By 1781, Britain shifted its strategy to the American South, hoping Loyalist support would turn the tide. General Charles Cornwallis marched through Virginia, confident of British victory. But Washington and his French allies had other plans. For the first time, the French commitment was decisive. Admiral de Grasse's navy cut off British reinforcements at sea. French troops under Rochambeau marched beside Washington. The rebellion was no longer alone. The might of France now fought against Britain, and the king's forces were trapped. October 1781. Washington's army and their French allies encircled Yorktown. Day and night, cannon fire rained upon Cornwallis's defenses. Yorktown was a cage, and the British lion was caught within it. On October 19, Cornwallis surrendered. Over 7,000 British troops laid down their arms. News of Yorktown reached London like a thunderbolt. For George, it was unthinkable. The world's greatest empire humbled by its own colonies. Parliament debated peace. Ministers argued the war was lost. But the king refused to believe it. "I will not consent to the dismemberment of this empire. The colonies will yet be ours." But the strain was undeniable. War debt soared. Soldiers and sailors were exhausted. Public opinion turned bitter. The empire faced not just America, but France, Spain, and Holland. No king, no army, no empire can fight the world forever. Even after Yorktown, George considered abdication rather than accepting defeat. He saw surrender as dishonor. To him, America was not land. It was legacy. Losing it meant losing himself. But by 1783, reality prevailed. Britain signed the Treaty of Paris, recognizing the independence of the United States. In that moment, George lost not just colonies, but an empire's future. The 13 colonies were gone. A new nation was born. Britain licked its wounds. The king retreated from public celebrations. His ministers turned against him. To the Americans, he was the tyrant they had defied. To his own people, he was the king who had lost America. Yorktown was not just a defeat. It was the end of a dream. For George III, the loss of America was more than political. It was personal, and the shadow of that loss would haunt him until his final days. He had ruled an empire, commanded armies, defied nations, but in the end George III would not be remembered for glory, but for loss. Of America, of his mind, of himself. After the Treaty of Paris in 1783, George remained on the throne. He tried to carry on with dignity, ruling Britain as best he could. But the weight of defeat never left him. Ministers quarreled. The people mocked him. And slowly, shadows crept into his mind. By the 1790s, George began to suffer episodes of mental illness. He spoke for hours without sense, raving in confusion. He would talk to trees, believing them to be kings of other lands. Doctors of the day called it madness. Modern historians suggest it may have been a disease called porphyria. The king who once defied a continent, now wrestled with the demons of his own mind. As George's health faltered, Parliament debated who would rule in his place. His own son, the Prince of Wales, prepared to act as regent. But George would return from madness, then fall again, then return once more. It was a cruel cycle. Moments of clarity, drowned by storms of delusion. Even as Britain fought Napoleon and reshaped Europe, George was increasingly absent. He was king in name, but often incapable of ruling. In 1810, after the death of his beloved daughter Amelia, his illness grew permanent. He slipped fully into insanity, blind, deaf, and alone. America was long lost. Now, so too was the king. George III died in 1820, after 59 years on the throne, the longest of any British king. To some, he was a tyrant, the villain of revolution. To others, a tragic monarch, more victim than villain. He lost America, but preserved Britain. He ruled through defeat, madness, and change. And though history remembers him as the king who lost a continent, Perhaps he was also a man who lost himself. In the end, history is not kind. Empires rise and fall. Kings are crowned and broken. And George III will forever be remembered by a single truth. He was the British king who lost America.